And before we start into things, I just want to give another gentle reminder that there'll be lots of discussions today. We're all individuals with unique ideas and perspectives. Please be respectful and kind to other attendees during our discussions today. As always, the chat will be open for all attendees to use. Before I start into objectives, I'm going to hand it over to Patty, who wants to just give a quick side note.
Hi, I just wanted to thank everybody for participating in the symposium. It's been really wonderful and super encouraging how many people have attended. And I also wanted to take a moment to thank the Pajarito Environmental Education Center. Kristen, you've just been an excellent moderator, and thank you so much. And they've done all this free of charge. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to let you know that if you want to, you can make a donation. And the mission of the center is to connect people with nature, and I think we can all agree that that's a really excellent mission for right now. And I think maybe Kristen, you could provide the link at some point, but I actually got a letter requesting a donation, so I'm going to just send a check, and I'm going to write my check today. So if anyone else can and wants to and can afford to, I'm sure they would really appreciate it.
Thank you for saying that, Patty. Yeah, we're so happy that we can do stuff like this with the community and surrounding communities. And what I've witnessed here, the work from this group is really amazing, and we're just happy to be involved. Okay, awesome. So today, what's going to happen? Today, we will be taking all the information and ideas gathered during yesterday's presentations and discussions. We will then focus on discussion and idea generating to begin specific conservation actions that would effectively address causes and reverse decline and other achievable actions that could benefit the species. For the first part of today, starting a little after now, we will be doing co-occurring breakout sessions on Zoom. The 3 sessions are as followed: Cuckoo modeling, research, and monitoring, how to incorporate learning objectives into adaptive management. Where, when, and who will do what's needed to be done next. And that will be moderated by Jenna Stanek. Number 2, session 2, what are our best guesses for the big limiting factors for the species, and what can we do on the ground right now to test hypotheses while also restoring, creating, and improving habitat for cuckoos? Where, when, and who will do what needs to be done next? And that will be led by Patty Wohner. Number 3 is technology and field techniques, such as problem solutions for finding birds and conforming breeding, banding techniques, radio transmitter, geolocator hardware, and techniques for putting on the birds. And that will be led by Callie Stanley. You can choose a session and stay there, or you can hop around. It's up to you. You do have the ability to do that. All you have to do, everybody will see once you're admitted into a breakout room, the option to leave that breakout room. If you push that button, you can choose a different room. And if you need help with that, please direct message me. Okay, so while we are in these breakout rooms, we will be using something called Google Jamboard to collect ideas. And let me just pull that up to show everybody, just in case you've never seen it before. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see this. This is what your document will look like when you enter the link, which I haven't shared yet. Jenna maybe just did. But this is what it'll look like. And so this is basically a tool to capture all your ideas during your discussion. And anybody that has access to the link can manipulate this document. So to go over the tools we have here, I'm gonna use the laser. So there is the pen tool, which is right here on the side. Oh, it won't let me do that. So here's the pen tool. This is a tool to draw, so you can draw with it. Right now I have it on a highlighter option, which I thought might be useful for this if you want to highlight certain text. But there's also a pen tool, a marker tool, you can change colors. Pretty self-explanatory. There is an eraser tool caveat to this. Please discuss with your group before you erase something. There is a selection tool, the arrow tool, pretty self-explanatory. You can select anything and move it around. There is a sticky note, which you can't see on my screen right now, but I'm going to write something on it. Not the most creative, but so this is my sticky note. These are best used for small questions or short comments. Text tends to like go over the side of the sticky note and it doesn't look very clean if that's what you're going for. You can also add images. There's an upload an image box where you can upload directly from your computer. Here, I'm going to upload something that I took off the internet today. So it should upload. That's a distribution map. You can also upload directly from Google using keywords. Next tool is a shape tool. You can change the color of the shapes up here on this pen icon. So you can change the color. You can also fill in the shape. And there is the most useful tool today is probably the text box. You can input a lot of different text in this, and you can also go back with a highlighter and highlight text if you would like to. And then when you are discussing at the end of your session, the moderator or whoever can use a laser to draw attention to a certain element. Okay, so that is Google Jamboard. It's a really useful tool for virtual meetings like this one. Okay, so I think Jenna actually added the link. That's the link you will access. Thanks, Jenna. That's the link you will access during this session, during your sessions. Each session has 2 pages on the Jamboard, so make sure that you are in the right session. I have labeled them, so you should get that indicator. The first 45 minutes of the session will be talking and allowing people to access and manipulate the Jamboard. The last 15 minutes is to organize the Jamboard and decide what will be reported back to the group. You will get a 2-minute warning before the breakout ends to wrap things up. And then of course, following the breakout, we will have an hour of the moderators reporting back about what is discussed. Again, you can jump back and forth between sessions if you would like. Does anyone have any questions before we get started? Great, awesome. So I am going to now open the rooms to everybody. If you came on a little late, I might have to reshare this with you, but we'll see what happens. Okay, the rooms are open. You should get a prompt at the bottom of your screen to select which room you would like to go to. Okay, so as people filter in, now we're going to turn to the moderators of each session, and they're going to give us a report back on what happened in each breakout room, in case you weren't able to be at every single one of them. So we'll just go down the list in order. We're going to start with modeling, research, and monitoring, and Jenna Stanek was moderator for that.
Hi there. So we had a lot of good discussion. I'll try to organize all the thoughts kind of. First, we talked about a full life cycle model with survivorship and how that would be important. Talked about maybe how that could be possible, and kind of came to the conclusion that at least for putting tags on the birds, we should focus on the stable populations, because these smaller populations maybe don't want to impact those. And then we were talking a bit about collecting blood and feathers, like if birds are being captured for any other reason, collecting blood and feathers, and working with Kristen Ruig. I'm sure you guys have probably seen her work, because it could help just identify the different populations of cuckoos and where they're going along their migration route. If there's enough data, I don't know. I mean, we'd have to contact her and see if there could be any collaboration. Kind of mentioned a little bit, like, do we already have blood and feathers that could be used for that type of project?
I just wanted to interject quickly. And
oh, go ahead, Callie.
I do actually think there is, I mean, bigger sample size is always better, but there is quite a lot of blood. I mean, quite a lot. There is blood and feather samples out there. I think the holdup here is finding the funding to do the lab work. Out there, but I think continued collection is ideal.
Okay, so good to know. So coordinating where there might already be blood and feathers that people are willing to donate to a project, and then also with working with Kristen Ruig to potentially write a grant. I don't know.
Yeah, Kristen is interested in cuckoos, and we did send them. Shannon sent them all of our samples, which is a ton. A lot of our samples, which is a ton.
Awesome.
And you know, they're getting feathers from other areas as well. So.
Okay, cool. So maybe just touching base with Kristen and seeing where they're at and how. I don't know.
Yeah,
okay.
where if you know where, yeah, exactly where they're at is a good way to put it.
And then also seeing who else might be interested in collecting feathers and blood. David Moore or David, would you guys in New Mexico? I don't know.
Yeah, when we capture and radio tag cuckoos in New Mexico, we do collect feather and blood samples that we send in to sex the birds. So that is something we're collecting anyways, and can certainly be involved in that.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so we then talked, let's see, did I cover everything? We did briefly discuss a 2 to 3 person traveling crew who would go around and capture cuckoos, but that seems like a pretty expensive endeavor, but I don't know. We talked a lot about coordinating survey monitoring between states and then also within the state, and potentially coordinated survey efforts in Mexico. I know that was touched on yesterday, that can be tricky with funding. And maybe it's pretty important to continue these coordinated surveys, because for smaller populations, the surveys can help better track the range-wide population. So if there's a decline in one state, what's the neighboring state doing? And the question came up, is there a database for cuckoo surveys within the states or range? Idaho said that they have survey data that goes to the IDFG IFWIS database. But, and I would imagine each state kind of has something like that. So I'm not sure that's coordinated database, but.
Yeah, it's their IFSWIS database for fish and game. And I'm sure they could figure out a way to share it or share just the cuckoo data, because most of it's searchable.
Yeah, this is Colleen Moulton from Idaho Fish and Game. We can readily share our data, and we've shared it with Utah for the range-wide modeling already.
Okay, great. That answers that question. Maybe someone could contact the people that were in charge of all the survey data for each state and ask if that's a possibility, or compile it themselves. I don't know. We also chatted about a lot about models, so feel free to jump in, any modeling people, but there was a lot of chat about the Hatton model that was developed from data on the Lower Colorado River, and how that can be used, suggested to run the satellite model range wide, overlay all the known cuckoo detections, and then establish relationships between cuckoo territories with density, and then the probability class, and then prioritize survey efforts based upon results. I mean, I think the CSWIG is kind of doing that effort already. I don't know if there's room for collaboration, or I'm not sure, but we talked a lot about that aspect of it. And then we also touched on that, you know, some of these riparian models, maybe they wouldn't work as well in some of these foothill and arroyo habitats in Arizona, New Mexico, and Mexico. Maybe the green up timing is different. And then also, what are we really trying to answer? Are we trying to answer like, where are the cuckoos, or what habitat are they using? Are they using outside of the riparian, or using these other habitats? And how important is the percentage of the population found in these areas in Arizona, New Mexico, and Mexico? The timing of the green up, riparian versus zero riparian. I guess I kind of already said that. I'm just filling you full of all this stuff. And then
sorry,
is my time up?
No, you're good. I just,
Okay.
I saw someone raise their hand in response to something that you said, but
oh yes, please.
I didn't catch who.
Anyone who is in my group, please jump in if I'm missing stuff or misrepresenting ideas.
Maybe they should go back.
This is Edwin Juarez, Arizona Game and Fish. And going back to the database comment, as part of the 6-week project, we have compiled significant amount of data across the range for the species distribution model. So I think that that's going to be a product that will be part of our 6-week report. So I think with the appropriate data sharing, agreements, it's something that could be used by the to answer specific questions that the partnership may come up with. So I think that's one of the major products of the 6-week project.
Great, thank you, Edwin. Yes, we did talk a little bit about insects, how they relate to the green up. Should insect abundance be an item collected on the survey form? Can we keep track of this? Would it even be helpful? How do we identify them? And yes, you can look over our Jamboard some more. There's some more detailed comments going into all those things, but that is kind of what we came up with. I'm not sure we really identified where, when, and who will do what needs to be done next, but maybe it's just kind of a start as far as coordinating with Kristen Ruig. I don't know what else. Sounds like the survey efforts are being coordinated. That's about all I have, I think. I think, Callie, maybe you'll talk a little bit more about the full life cycle model with survivorship, because that was something that we talked about. Just, I don't know, how do you move that forward and figure out survivorship? Can you use banding data and recapture data to answer those questions?
Yeah, we tried to talk about it in our section, but there wasn't much. We didn't have many ideas, but I think survivorship data is the thing that is missing most. And the satellite tags, although we are still attempting to extract survival data from these satellite tags, they aren't the best type of tag to get to get mortality information from. It would be great if there was banding data, like mark recapture type data. I just don't know if that's out there for cuckoos because they're so difficult, to catch. And I don't think we're catching individuals multiple times. In the East, like the MAPS program catches some cuckoos. And so we're hoping to maybe use survival estimates out East from MAPS, but there isn't that comparable data set for the Western birds. So in New Mexico, I think there's MAPS data that might be okay. But it would be great to hear if people think there is a data set that could be used to measure survival for Western cuckoos.
What about the lower Colorado River banding project? They have multiple years of banding.
I suspect we probably have the best mark recapture data set out there. We're no longer funded but we 2016 was kind of our last big Vending year, and so the recaptures and resites have gone down every year since then. But yeah, I would say that's probably the best start.
So yeah, I mean, having it from one site, I mean, that's obviously much better than nothing, but ideally we would want to have survivorship data across more sites.
I'm pretty sure they also have some from the Sacramento River Valley. I know they did banding there. And I think SSRS also probably has some from the Kern River Valley. I mean, not as much as the lower Colorado River, but you know, you'd have something really similar.
Yeah, and I think there's some really interesting modeling approaches that can use, you know, kind of disparate survival analysis and just kind of model survival based on those. And so we wouldn't be getting, you know, yearly survival estimates, but at least we could plug in some more realistic survival estimates for cuckoos and then use that as a base for an integrated population model. So if people do have some kind of, even if they're shorter term survival data sets, like marker capture data sets, that would be very helpful, no matter how small they are. Short term, not.
Yeah, the problem is cuckoos are so hard to recite that your probability of detection is really low. So that kind of makes, you know, that variability and modeling survival a little more difficult. So, you know, at the Kern, yeah, we have color banded cuckoos, a few at a time, but you know, our resites are few and far between. And we did capture a cuckoo from the Sacramento River, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, that was cool. Mark, did you want to say something?
I was just gonna say, yeah, like we caught 2 birds in 1 year. Like we don't have necessarily data other than that data of the bird that moved between sites between years.
So Callie, just so I can think about this a little bit in my own head moving forward, for survivorship data, like hypothetically you got data, even if it's from 1, maybe 2 sites, could you write a grant, or could someone write a grant and then it could be like a postdoc or PhD project, or like, I don't know, how would that work? Or Mary, was there something with that you guys were going to do with it? Or I'm trying to remember if someone was going to do something with it.
No, we don't have any plans. I mean, we're doing prey-based stuff and work here. That's about it.
And I just want to add on what Mary said. Since the mid 80s, there have been hundreds of nestlings banded on the Kern River. And in the years I was here, I think there were 1 or 2 sightings. And Mary, I don't know if you've had any more since then, but as she says, it's so hard to find a cuckoo and then see a cuckoo and then see a cuckoo's legs, because they sit on their legs when they're perched. And so you have like a split second to get that look and see if there's even a band there, let alone what the band is. So yeah, just everything conspires to make it difficult to have resites once you actually even catch them to put bands on them.
So true, but I know Shannon and Diane have done it.
Oh, they are fantastic, and there's no question about that. Yeah, and they've got a good crew and well-trained people, and they've done absolutely like the gold standard, platinum standard work down there for sure.
I was going to go back to my Jamboard real quick because I only have a few minutes left, but I forgot to mention that someone had put on there, any Yellowbill cuckoo survey efforts in 2022 can contribute data to the CSWIG effort. And our question was, if someone is interested in contributing, who do you contact, or who can they contact? Their state Yellowbill cuckoo representative, or?
This is Edwin. Well, go ahead, John.
Yeah, their state cuckoo person will be the person to contact, and state coordinators will be contacting everyone that they know who will be conducting cuckoo surveys. So the sampling effort for the CSWIGS project will largely be a a random allocation of sample units to be surveyed. And many of you here will likely be surveying some of those areas. So everyone will be approached to be brought into the fold. And yeah, and hopefully there will be zero duplication of effort. If Kristen and David are surveying areas on the Middle Rio Grande, the CSWIG project should not be surveying those exact same areas as well. So there will be some discussions in the near future.
I'd add to that, that if you're not sure who your state lead is, go to the Pacific Flyway Council website and look at the non-game tech committee. There's a list of all the state representatives. They'll know who is coordinating in your state.
Yeah, John, that's the plan. And Aaron DeVouvier has already actually just last week reached out to let us know of the effort and, kind of the collaboration interest. So we're on it.
Great.
Awesome.
Yeah, and just from a permitting standpoint too, I think the Fish and Wildlife Service leads try to kind of organize that so folks aren't surveying the same areas as well, just on a general basis. So.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm done, Kristen, if you want to.
So I'm going to pass it over to Callie, and you're reporting about limiting factors.
That's actually Patty. I'm the last one.
Oh, sorry. I totally looked at the wrong person. Patty, please take it away.
Okay, thanks. I think I'm going to share my screen. So if that's cool.
Give me
so
1 second and I'll
okay.
co-host you. There you go. You should be able now.
All right, is it sharing?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, so our question was, what are the best guesses for the big limiting factors for the species, and what can we do on the ground right now to test hypotheses while also restoring, creating, and improving habitat for cuckoos? Where, when, and who will do what needs to be done next? And so we kind of broke this down into there's three kind of components of this question. The first part of it was, what are the big limiting factors? And so that's what we discussed first. And then we went on to what we can try to do onto the ground, and then tried to get at where, when, and who will do what needs to be done next. I think that's a really hard question, like Jenna found. So we kind of had three topics, and I kind of divided this one page and tried to organize it a little bit into the three sections that we thought were the big limiting factors, and then we talk about those through each of the three different groups. So the big thing we spent a lot of time talking about was the prey base and food availability on the breeding ground, especially on the breeding ground. We talked about that the most, but we also thought it would be, a limiting factor is what are they eating on during migration, and also on the wintering ground. And we had a lot of good ideas about how to actually get at that question about food availability. And one thing we also noted that our topic kind of overlapped with everyone else's topics as well, and we were kind of talking about the same things, but that we could address this question with the range-wide surveys that are going to be done, and maybe possibly integrating some prey-based studies or surveys while people are actually out there surveying for cuckoos somehow, which I think Jenna also touched on. We came up with a lot of ideas about this as well, about maybe how to incorporate it into new research. So some of the ideas that we came up with were, well, maybe some species other than willow, cottonwood actually provide more food for cuckoos, and we could maybe have some kind of alternate management where we would say, when maybe not within the riparian area itself, but on the agricultural edges, maybe convince stakeholders like farmers and landowners to plant tree species or forbs or vegetation that would increase prey diversity and abundance next to the stand, or even possibly within you know, especially on the breeding ground within the riparian area. So that was an idea that we had. Somebody also commented that, well, do we really know what cuckoos really prefer? There's been a couple of studies historically, but you know, maybe a meta-analysis or looking back at data that's out there, and then maybe incorporating some new studies, possibly at banding stations, you know, doing regurgitation studies or something like that in places that are already catching cuckoos. Let's see. Another important thing we talked about was how are pesticides in agricultural areas, because so many, at least on the breeding ground and likely also on the wintering ground as well, agriculture is kind of, you know, right adjacent to cuckoo habitat. And so how are pesticides affecting availability of prey? And this is something that we could probably actually get at with these surveys, just by making notes of what is the habitat that's next or adjacent to cuckoo habitat, or some of the areas that we're finding cuckoos and some of the areas we're not finding cuckoos.
And I just wanted to mention that in Argentina, Aves Argentina is actually really worried about pesticide use in the Gran Chaco because the Gran Chaco in Argentina is really being transformed by soy production. And so that's really one of their concerns. And they're trying to find funding to look at that, just to throw that out there.
Right, so it's not just on the breeding ground, you know, that we need to be looking at this. It's, you know, across the whole life cycle, probably makes sense. And, you know, we do know that there's been studies out there, there's a worldwide decline in insects. So it would make sense that this would have something to do with it. But like some of us were also saying, we don't know, like, we don't know whether this is a limiting factor. We need to test it. And, but this is one area where it just seems like we have really limited knowledge thus far. If anyone else has anything to add, anything that I missed on that topic from the group, but I think that sums up that. The other thing that we talked about was working with private landowners to create breeding and foraging habitat. And so we talked a lot about how we could come up with recommendations, or I guess the main thing that came out of that was the idea of creating kind of like a one-pager that summarizes, you know, do we have something broad that we could tell people that this is what you should be doing or you could do to help cuckoos? Like, is there something that's across the range, a unified approach to restoration that we could write in just like a one-pager to sort of get things started? You know, given that the recovery plan will be done for quite a few years, or 4 or 5 years. And then in that one pager, the idea of having something like this would help us engage with stakeholders and landowners, that we could give this to people and try to get buy-in, and possibly even, you know, maybe incorporate things like trying to get landowners to not use as many pesticides, or paying them not to use as many pesticides, or pesticides next to or adjacent to these riparian areas where we know that cuckoos are and other species. We didn't really come up with like where, you know, where we would do restoration, or where the low-hanging fruit is necessarily. That was something that actually came up, though, was that we should try to focus restoration in areas with low hanging fruit. And some of us are thinking that the breeding ground is perhaps the lowest hanging fruit. Like I'm not sure actually with cuckoos that there is low hanging fruit, but maybe lowest hanging, you know, like I think it's, you know, some of these recovery efforts are going to be pretty hard. So yeah, but maybe focusing in on areas in the core of the range, like where we know that there's lots of cuckoos that we can kind of have an experiment. So places like Arizona, where there seems to be like a few populations left, where we could try to implement some restoration on the ground. But that was kind of as close as we got to like a where exactly would we do some of these restoration ideas. But definitely we would want to incorporate some of these prey questions that we have. And also what works for restoration. Anyone have anything else to add there? We actually filled out a couple pages, and we have some more ideas on our second page here.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to also mention is Jeff Geipel. He had an important point that we need to come up with geographic specific restoration planting palettes. And that incorporates future climate scenarios as well. So you want it to be sustainable. And that's a really good point, because what works in one region may not work in another.
Yeah, and especially with climate change, you know, things will change in the future. So being able to kind of identify what works well for what types of climates. And then this was a third topic that we came up with, and we did spend most of the time talking about prey, but we did talk about also these areas in the Gran Chaco and how we would try to conserve them. It seems like currently there's not a lot of protective measures. Like here we have, you know, critical habitat and areas that are protected, but some of these areas, you know, maybe they're not limiting right now, but in the future they could definitely be limited if some of the practices that are happening down there aren't sort of I don't know what can be done, but stalled or some of these areas protected. So trying to figure out ways that we can work with stakeholders there, and actually we had some encouraging talk about some partnerships that have already been formed south of the border, and opportunities to work with some of these partners down there. But the main thing was for the tropical dry forest is trying to figure out what are the biggest threats there. And I don't think like a whole lot of work has been done there, as we know. And so trying to figure out the major limiting factors down there in the wintering areas is a big first step. So the where of that was kind of an easy thing for us to come up with for the wintering ground, at least in the Gran Chaco.
And just to throw in, yeah, I completely agree with what everything Patty just said. We really just don't have a very good idea of what's limiting birds on the wintering ground. We know what our threats in the Gran Chaco, just broad threats. But there are a lot of stakeholders down there that are interested in doing research. It's really just a matter of finding funding for this work in the wintering grounds. And so we talked about this a bit yesterday, but I see here the NMBCA program. I think that is potentially a good funding source, though they tend to favor conservation projects, not research projects, to like understand stuff. So yeah, finding ways to there are groups working down there that would love money to do more work in the Gran Chaco. We just need to find out how to get them some funding. The Gran Chaco is huge, so, you know, and we know that the cuckoos are moving around a lot down there. So we really have to kind of think big when we're thinking about how we're going to study them down there.
Right, and we could actually even pair up doing our research in the conservation areas through adaptive management. So where if that's where the funding comes from to do actual conservation.
Yeah, I was just thinking one potential funding source for that work on the wintering grounds. I mean, it's not doing the research, but maybe some of the restoration or land protection might be that 30 by 30 initiative, maybe. If you knew anybody involved with that. Go ahead, Edwin.
Sorry, Mary. For NIMCA, you know, if there's restoration projects or there's work in the breeding grounds that's happening that's of non-federal origin, some of that could be used as match to fund some of the work in the wintering grounds. And so just think about that as we, it'll be good to think about that as we explore potential collaboration with partners south of the border, is that if you can, you know, realistically link an activity here in the breeding grounds, especially as we learn more about these linkages between breeding and wintering, that some of that work that if it's non-federal origin in the US could serve as match. Because NIMCA has a high bar for match purposes, I think it's 3 to 1.
And the other thing to keep in mind is because the work is being done in South America, in-kind match it still has to be non-federal, but in-kind match is accepted. Whereas NMVCA in the US, it has to be in cash contributions. So that is another thing that makes it slightly easier for work in South America, but it's still a high bar, that 3 to 1 match.
Yeah, and I also want to say, don't forget the stopover sites, because those are really important too. So that would include Mexico and Central America. And Colombia.
Right, I'm going to change the sticky note here and include that.
Patty, I have a comment.
Sure.
I haven't heard anybody talking about geomorphology. We've talked a little bit about hydrology here and there, but no one has mentioned geomorphology, which is a separate issue from hydrology. And in the breeding grounds on the riparian areas, we really need to be encouraging water managers not to riprap their banks. We want regenerative restoration, which I haven't heard anybody talking about yet. And, you know, that's where humans are not the major force behind the regeneration of these riparian communities. And it's a super critical thing that if we want to be efficient in terms of economics, we want nature to be doing this stuff. And nature's much better at it than we are. And on the Sacramento River, you know, you can get massive amounts of habitat in episodic episodes, you know, with a wet year, but with riprap in place, that doesn't happen. So I think somewhere in this limiting factors topic, we need to put in geomorphology, you know, the setting up of the different landforms that create willow and cottonwood, as opposed to us planting it all the time. I just think that needs to be somewhere in here.
I couldn't agree more. This is something that's interesting because I'm working on this issue with, I'm working with Chinook salmon now. And so this is a topic that people are constantly talking about. And I really see a lot of parallels with managing for certain stages of Chinook salmon. And I mentioned this in our next topic, and also yellow-billed cuckoo habitat. It's really interesting. And there's actually quite a bit of money for Chinook salmon in trying to get, you know, functional flows back into the system. And I think it could benefit other things and, bird species enormously.
That's huge. And there's so much money for salmon, and
Yeah.
we need to link into that. That's a great idea.
Yeah. I think it's right set up. The out migrating Chinook salmon, the juveniles need to stage, and they stage in the spring, right, when cottonwood and willow are germinating on the floodplain. And there's been a lot of efforts recently to expand the floodplain so that there can be more natural processes happening, at least in the Central Valley of California.
Yeah, excellent.
Patty, this is Jen Holmes. Maybe I missed something or you're going to bring it up, but I would think one of the big limiting factors is also water availability, which Steve is talking about too. It's just stepped up basically to, that seems like that's going to be the limiting factor in the years to come.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We need to address the water issue as well. But if you've got riprap, it's not going to, you could have as much water as you want, but you're not going to get regeneration. So that's, right. We need to decouple them and deal with them separately.
And related, another overarching issue across the West right now is sustainable groundwater management. And, we're talking about most of these cuckoo habitat is, in groundwater dependent ecosystems, at least dependent on groundwater for much of the year. So there's going to be increasing threats, and we really need to be thinking ahead to that.
Sorry for my typing.
Has anybody thought about reaching out to Department of Agriculture, APHIS, about their range-wide efforts with the southwestern willow flycatcher? There's so much overlap. And I think that's the point with the Chinook salmon comments. I work a lot with fish too, so I know that. Multi-species, so many species need the same habitat, or at least portions of the same habitat. And we're talking about healthy floodplains, and we're talking about water availability. We're talking about healthy riparian vegetation, and a lot of the threats that threaten one species threaten all the others. So here's an effort focusing on the yellow-billed cuckoo, but I wonder if there could be an opportunity to reach out and collaborate with another effort, the southwestern willow flycatcher, and specifically with River's Edge West and APHIS, Department of Agriculture, to maybe share some of these efforts to promote more of a multi-species conservation.
Patty, I just want to let you know you have about 30 seconds to wrap it up.
Okay. Yeah, I think the multi-species conservation comment is a good one and absolutely essential. I'm going to write that down here. While I'm doing that, does anyone have anything that they'd like to add in the last 30 seconds? And this is something we, we'll be able to continue talking about as we move forward.
Perfect. Awesome. We're going to pass it to Kelly, who is going to report back on the discussion around technology and field techniques.
Okay, yeah. So, and again, please interrupt me if I'm forgetting something, people that are in my session. So we kind of split up the section. The first topic we covered was how to find birds and what the most way. I think we all kind of like acknowledge that the standardized survey protocols need to be kept as such. But in terms of finding new areas where cuckoos might be, there was some thought about mixing up some of the survey techniques. Like, for example, adding coos to the end of the call, maybe changing the frequency of the calls, And also being very mindful of the timing of the year, based on, somewhat John's results, how much calls were related to breeding status. And so that was one of the things we talked about, maybe being more flexible when just searching for areas with birds. We did talk a lot about we talked a bit about the ARUs and how helpful that could be. And it seems like the ARUs can be very helpful, but they're, you have to work within a set of parameters for your site. And Linnea seems to have a lot of experience, and she's got it working really well on her site. Nick, came up was presenting yesterday about some of the methods. So maybe it's worthwhile like putting that information together so it's more accessible for people. In particular, Linnea was talking about like how important the software that you have and the hardware, the speakers and microphone quality. She was saying that for her array, they really only pick up, 75 to 100 meters. So, if you're wanting to cover a certain area, you need to have these AR units, spaced out in between. So it might be useful to have like a report just detailing those to make it easier for other people thinking about using that technology. And in particular, I had been kind of nervous that maybe, the technology wouldn't work as well in low density areas where the birds aren't calling as much. But Linnea assured us that it's working well in her area of low density. So that could be an area if the ARUs could be a really helpful solution, but maybe having like a protocol or something in place, not a protocol, but a best to guide. We also talked about how best to follow birds. We talked about the MODIS network, and I think everyone was pretty excited about the possibility of using the MODIS network, but also, acknowledge the fact that it's not quite up there, especially for, monitoring birds as they're leaving sites. And so, I think everyone was happy to continue supporting the MODIS network that is being formed out west, but that it's maybe not quite there to be used immediately for cuckoo research, especially research trying to figure out where birds are going when they're leaving particular sites. We did talk a bit about types of harnesses and attaching transmitters to birds, and I think the takeaway we came at was, for one, how important it is to make sure everyone's trained on attaching transmitters. And so this isn't necessarily a technique that anyone can use, that it really is important to have training on especially using harnesses, which harnesses are best. And in terms of which harnesses to select, it really depends on how long you want the transmitter to stay on the bird, like what your questions are. Diane mentioned that for them, they had a lot of success gluing the transmitters onto the Rectrix, so you could get a couple weeks with it on the Rectrix. If you glue it to the bird itself, they tend to fall off pretty easily, but that's maybe not a problem depending on what your specific questions are. And so, yeah, I guess that's kind of it on the harness. In terms of measuring vital rates, we talked about measuring breeding. I think we all acknowledged how difficult it is to measure breeding for cuckoos, just in terms of because it's really hard to find nests and breeding. I think there is a lot of people, and there's a lot of great knowledge out there in terms of finding nests and looking for the behavior of pairs that will help you find nests, but because densities of cuckoos are so low, it's hard to transmit that information. One thing we talked about trying to help people find nests was using radio tracking, and so deploying tags on birds specifically just to locate the nests to make it easier. A really important point that Diane brought up in terms of tracking birds on the breeding grounds is to not deploy your tags too early in the season. When birds first start arriving, a lot of the birds are just going to disappear and leave, either because they're migrating or they just decide to move on. And so really not deploying transmitters until later, once birds are already starting to breed. We talked a bit about survival. I mean, we talked about it in this group, survival, how to measure survival. So I don't think we really need to cover that, even though it would be great. I mean, I think we all know how important it would be. And then we talked a bit about measuring prey base. It sounds like other people talked about it as well. We didn't really come up with a great solution in the group. I think the cicada surveys that John mentioned are great at like incorporating some kind of insect monitoring into the standard survey protocol. Diane brought up that, you know, one of the best ways to see what birds are feeding to the young is just getting a good camera and setting it up at a nest. And so at least on the breeding grounds, that might be one of the most effective ways to at least establish what the prey is. And then in terms of actually measuring the prey base, yeah, I think we didn't necessarily come up. I think using NDVI and green up could be a great way, but I think it would be important to actually know. I think using NDVI will be very dependent on the region you're in and what, you know, how that relates to insect abundance. And it might not be as great in all regions. And yeah, in terms of acceptable weight for yellow-billed cuckoo backpacks, you usually, for cuckoos, it's hard to get a 5%. I mean, the general rule is to use under 5%, but the bird banding lab generally doesn't give out anything above 4%. And out west, they often restrict it to 3%, under 3%. So that's also something to bear in mind. When it comes to radio tracking or coded tags for MODIS, that's like really not much of a problem. But for GPS tags or satellite tags, that can be really difficult to get to catch a bird that's big enough to put a 2-gram tag. That can be really hard. And yeah, like Shannon and Diane, they've been working with 3%. Out east, I've gotten 4%. But you really do have to argue with the bird banding lab to get anything above that. So I think that kind of covers our section. Are there any questions or any other comments that maybe I missed?
Okay, if not, nice, we got a thumbs up. I think we're good. I think if there's no other comments, we have a lunch break now from 11 to 12. So we can go ahead and you can leave your screens on or you can log off and log back on at 12 o'clock.